What's going on? In today's video, I'm going to do a quick comparison between the Canon RF-S 18 to 45mm kit lens and the new RF-S 10 to 18mm lens. Now, right off the bat, you might not even be able to tell a difference between these lenses. They are very similar size, weight, and shape, almost identical actually. But there definitely are some differences between these that I'm going to mention in this video. And I'm even going to compare things like sharpness and vignetting and things like that a little bit later on. So without further ado, this is the 18 to 45 versus the 10 to 18. Alright, so first up, like I said, these almost look identical when they're kind of compacted down like this. However, both of these lenses, in order to use them, you kind of have to pull them out of this storage configuration and kind of turn them over to the usable range, where both of these lenses kind of get extended out a little more. And so then at that point, you can see the 10 to 18 is definitely smaller than the 18 to 45. Which sticks out quite a bit more when it's in its actually usable configuration. However, even though the 18 to 45 is bigger, the 10 to 18 weighs a little bit more. It actually comes in at 5.3 ounces versus 4.6 ounces on the 18 to 45. So one's a little bit bigger, one's a little heavier. Again, they kind of even out, but you can see the 18 to 45 is definitely noticeably longer. Now also, neither of these lenses have any sort of buttons or dials or switches or anything like that on them. Besides, they both have the control ring, which can be either a control ring or a focus ring, but there isn't a switch to change that. You actually have to go into the camera menu to change that on these lenses. I would have liked to see a stabilization switch as well as a manual and autofocus switch on these, just so it's easier and quicker to turn those on and off without having to jump into the menu. But I do understand that that would have made these probably a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier, as well as potentially more expensive, having to add more things to them. But it is something that I kind of do wish was in these lenses. Now also, they're both f4.5 to f6.3 lenses, which means in their widest focal length, which would be 18mm on the 18 to 45, and 10mm on the 10 to 18, they have maximum apertures of f4.5, which is kind of slow. It's not extremely slow, but f4.5 is definitely a fairly slow aperture, which means it's going to give you a darker image, a little bit less background separation than a wider aperture lens would. And then also, both of these lenses, when they're in their most zoomed in focal length, are at f6.3, which is a pretty dark f-stop. When you're zoomed in, you're gonna have to bump your ISO up quite a bit more. And the slow aperture on these is really something else that goes along with, you know, the fact that these are just so small. If Canon gave these faster apertures like an f4 or an f2.8 or something like that, they would be substantially larger lenses than they are, and substantially more expensive. So it's just another trade-off that you're gonna have to deal with these more budget lenses. But the first big difference with these is their close focus distance. So the 10 to 18mm lens has a close focus distance of 5.5 inches, but it's actually a little bit different than that. I'll talk about it in just a second. And then the 18 to 45mm lens has a close focus distance of 7.9 inches, so a little bit farther than the 10 to 18. However, if you switch to manual focus mode and zoom out to 10mm with the 10 to 18, you can get macro type of shots with the 10 to 18. And I don't mean like you can get pretty close up. Like, you can actually focus all the way down to something that is against the lens of this camera, like touching the glass element. That's how close this can focus in manual focus mode, and only when you're at 10mm. That is a huge advantage of this lens, and you can get some crazy, really interesting macro shots with this wide angle lens. And it's just a really cool feature that the 18 to 45mm lens can't even come close to. Now, the last few things physically, both of these have 4 stops of image stabilization built in, which is awesome to see on these budget and small of lenses. They both have built-in stabilization, so even if you have a Canon camera that doesn't have IBIS built into it, like the Canon R10, R100, or R50, these will still provide some sort of image stabilization, so if you're recording videos or taking photos, they won't be quite as shaky and blurry as if you had a lens that didn't have stabilization. And then the autofocus on both of these is amazing. Not a single flaw, hiccup, or issue with the autofocus. I would say the 10-18 might be a little faster, which makes sense because it's, you know, a substantially newer lens. But both of these lenses have like perfectly silent, extremely fast, pretty much flawless autofocus. And that's pretty much all there is when it comes to, you know, the physical differences between these. But now it's time to jump into things like sharpness and vignetting, where there are definitely some more differences. All right, so let's go ahead and jump over to that and compare some photos taken with both of these lenses and see which one is the better lens overall. So let's go ahead and take a look side by side at some images between the 10 to 18 and the 18 to 45mm lenses. And so you can see both lenses are very sharp in the center, and you can see it honestly looks like the 18 to 45mm kit lens, wide open at f4.5 at 18mm. Looks like it's a little bit sharper than the 10 to 18 in the center, wide open at f6.3, so an even slower aperture, and slightly less sharp zoomed into the center than the 18 to 45 millimeter kit lenses. Now in the corners, it's a little bit of a different story. So you can see at 18 millimeters, the 18 to 45 millimeter lens has quite a bit more vignetting. The corners are a lot darker. It definitely has noticeably more vignetting than the 10 to 18 millimeter, again at 18 millimeters. And also in the 18 to 45 millimeter, the corners are pretty soft and a little bit smeared or stretched. While in the 10 to 18 millimeter, the corners are actually very sharp and they're not stretched or anything like that. And there's also not very much vignetting. So the corners at 18 millimeters on the 10 to 18 millimeter lens look very, very good. Now with the 18 to 45, as you stop down to about f8, the corners really don't sharpen up much, maybe a very small amount. But by the time you get to f8, it does get rid of most of that vignetting. So in terms of sharpness, both of these lenses are pretty close at 18 millimeters. But I would say overall, the 10 to 18 millimeter definitely pulls ahead of the 18 to 45 overall. Even though it's not quite as sharp wide open in the center, the differences in corner sharpness and vignetting definitely outweigh that center sharpness. But that wraps up the comparison between the 10 to 18 and the 18 to 45 Canon RF lenses. I would say if you just can't find yourself getting quite wide enough for what you need with the 18 to 45 kit lens, the 10 to 18 is a no-brainer. You're gonna have that 10 to 18 millimeter focal range to choose from, so it's not just a fixed focal length like the RF 16 millimeter would be. It has great stabilization, super fast and silent autofocus. It's the same size and almost the same weight as the kit lens, so it really feels like there's nothing on your camera when this lens is on. So for this wide of a lens at just over $300, the 10 to 18 is an amazing bang for the buck lens, and I would highly recommend it if it fits into the type of lenses that you need.